All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you who might be watching over our live stream. It's wonderful to be here. My name is Alex Cooley. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College in New York, also the current vice provost for research there, a senior research associate at Harriman's Columbia Institute. And today's panel is a three-way multinational collaboration involving here the Institute for International Relations of Pandion, and thank you so much to Ino once again for partnering with us. And then two Columbia entities, the Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia and Eurasia, and also the newly established Columbia Global Center here in Athens. So it's a tripartite sponsorship. We're also thankful to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for providing support for this event today. Now, the event today was born out of a network of research collaboration that I think we've been now, I think Kirsten hosted the first of these about five, 6 years ago, on a team of researchers from different disciplines that study the offshore world, right? We hear a lot about the offshore world, offshore companies. Sometimes it's associated with shady deals, money laundering, and so forth. But here you have three true experts who have studied it from very different perspectives using quite creative, I would say, research methodologies. And part of what we're doing here today is bringing our interest in Russia and especially sanctions into dialogue about the offshore world, right? And especially when we think about 2 years onwards, Western sanctions in Russia, have they worked? And I think the answer would be, in some ways, they have done some long-term damage, certainly to the Russian economy, but certainly they have not stopped the Russian military campaign. And the initial anticipation that the Russian economy would be damaged 8 to 10% of its GDP by Western sanctions was quite overly ambitious and overinflated. Initially, the damage was about 3% of GDP, and now we see the Russian economy growing on a robust military production capacity. And now we've also seen reports of all sorts of, I would say, innovations, accommodations, reroutings that Russia and Russian companies have managed to innovate to get around sanctions, whether that is the re-export trade from neighboring countries, so Chinese goods coming into Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and then being re-exported, building a shadow fleet for the carrying of Russian oil and trade, swaps with Middle Eastern countries. And then I would say, to get into today's topic, while we saw several Russian oligarchs and individuals sanctioned, in addition to the sectoral sanctions, and we saw the film of seizures of yachts, right, from ports in Italy and so forth, we started then getting images weeks later of those same yachts popping up in places like Dubai, or places where the sanctions regime has not been maintained. So I think the topic for today is an attempt to sort of figure out not only how the Russian economic entities and political advisors have used the offshore system to reroute and get around sanctions, but also to draw upon the experts here to tell us where the offshore system is going, right, and whether it's been affected by this massive sanctions regime itself. I think the two are in somewhat of a symbiosis. So just to briefly introduce our speakers, to my left, Professor Brooke Harrington, who is a professor of sociology at Dartmouth College, author of Capital Without Borders, which is a wonderful study of wealth managers and their secretive world, highly recommended. And then a new book, which we'll shamelessly plug, Offshore. And what's the subtitle?
Stealth Wealth and the New Colonialism.
Stealth Wealth and the New Colonialism, which will be out in the fall. So welcome, Brooke. To my right, Professor Jason Sharman, who has this wonderful title, the Sir Patrick Sheehy Professor of International Relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge. I just know him as Jason. Jason is the author of many books, too many to list. I think some of the pertinent ones of today's discussion is The Despot's Guide to Wealth Management, an intriguing study called Global Shell Games, which perhaps you'll tell us a little bit more about, as well as some really interesting work on the Indo-Pacific space and European colonialism and so forth. So Jason, welcome. And you also have a new book out on the offshore world that'll be coming out next year. Genesis, excellent. So we'll float some of these ideas today. And then to Jason's right, delighted to welcome Professor Kristen Surak, who's an associate professor of political sociology at the London School of Economics and the author of The Golden Passport, Global Mobility for Millionaires. And also copy here, and Kristen studies a lot of these citizenship by investment types of schemes that are out there. So let's plunge right into it. Rather than give presentations, I prepared some questions for our panelists to come at them from their different perspectives. And of course, we'll save some time in the end for your own comments as well and questions for our panels. So the first question is, how have Western sanctions on Russia impacted the development or the misdevelopment of the offshore world in the areas that you research or study? And perhaps implicit in that is, tell us a little bit about the areas that you research and study. So, Brooke, floor is yours.
One of the most surprising things that happened after the invasion in February 2022 was something that was always said to be completely impossible in the offshore world suddenly happened. And that was a bunch of offshore centers got together and picked up the veil of secrecy to show us what was going on with their Russian clients, and they kicked some of those Russian clients out. This was always said to be economically and politically unfeasible. Now, of course, you can imagine what would happen if the offshore world got together and did that for other oligarchs. The whole system would collapse instantaneously because it operates on secrecy. And to have secrecy destroyed from within was really quite extraordinary. It was a brief moment, but it happened. Switzerland got in there, little Monaco, the UK, the EU, the US, even Singapore chipped in to basically rat on or narc out their Russian clients, fundamentally opposed to their own business model. What I've wondered, but haven't been able to find out as yet, is what signal did that send to all the other oligarchs who weren't Russian, who weren't exposed in this way by the people they trusted in places like Switzerland? I would have thought it would send a rather negative signal, like, wow, we better take our business elsewhere because, look, under the right circumstances, these people are willing to give us up and our secrecy. As far as I know, and maybe Jason or Kristen is better informed on this, that exodus hasn't happened. But that would be a question I would have going forward.
Great. And perhaps maybe you can tell us a little bit about I know you study wealth managers, and I'll ask you about that in a little while. What have you found out with some of your colleagues in Dartmouth about wealth managers and Russian oligarchs and how they might be different than other types of global oligarchs?
So after more than a decade of studying the offshore world purely in a qualitative way, first by training to become an offshore wealth manager, and then spending time observing, practicing wealth managers in 18 offshore centers all over the world. I had to do that because people who manage wealth for oligarchs don't talk to sociologists if you email them or call them. They don't talk to journalists. There are actually legal penalties in some jurisdictions against wealth managers talking about their work with outsiders. So I had to become a quasi-insider in order to get information. I never practiced as a wealth manager, but I did get the credential. It took 2 years. And that was my ticket to enter their professional society meetings and to gain enough trust that individual wealth managers would meet with me. Could you remind me of the question again?
No, your network map of
Yes.
the client, the wealth managers of Russian clients and how that differs from others.
So my last book, my first book about offshore finance came out in 2016, a few months after the Panama Papers. And then, of course, the Paradise Papers happened in 2017 and the Pandora Papers in 2021, creating almost 7 terabytes of data that it was kind of messy. It was designed for journalists to use, but if cleaned up in the right way, it could be used to look at the big picture patterns of what was happening offshore. And so I've spent the last couple of years looking for partners with network science skills to test propositions from my qualitative research using this massive trove of data from the offshore leaks. So that's what Alex is referring to. I've published one article that actually pinpoints the very special ways that Russian oligarchs use the offshore system. It doesn't look like the way that other oligarchs do it. For one thing, it's more like what you would expect in a mafia kind of society, in that a very small number of wealth managers are entrusted with information about what these oligarchs actually own. Carefully guarded secret. And the thing is, the oligarchs, of course, are tight with each other, so they all tend to focus and concentrate their business on the same wealth managers. So what I and my colleagues Herbert Chang and Dan Rockmore found at Dartmouth was these patterns of a very special kind of network in which it's organized like a hub and spoke system, like airlines. I don't know what a good European equivalent of this would be. But
Frankfurt.
when Frankfurt goes down in the European airline hub, for example, if bad weather strikes Frankfurt, you know how that has ripple effects throughout all European flights? Oh, I know, perfect example. Remember like 12 years ago, 14 years ago when that volcano went off in Iceland and it shut down a lot of European air travel? That kind of hub and spoke system is very robust in some circumstances, in most circumstances. But if you know where the hubs are, you can make the whole system break down. And it turns out that when you look at the leaked data, that the offshore networks of Russian oligarchs are organized precisely as these kind of hub and spoke systems. The hubs are the wealth managers. So if you can take them out of the picture somehow, for example, by sanctioning them and forbidding them to work with sanctioned individuals, then the offshore networks of these oligarchs kind of disintegrate. Now, of course, we couldn't run that experiment in real life, but we could simulate it, and it appears that that would be a very effective sanctioning strategy. In addition to, or instead of sanctioning the oligarchs themselves, sanction the people who connect them to their own wealth. Because the oligarchs aren't sitting on their yachts paging through the tax code of the Cayman Islands. They have people to do that for them. Even very smart oligarchs couldn't do it even if they wanted to. They have to outsource this. So they're dependent in a very fundamental way on these experts. Take the experts away by forbidding them to work with sanctioned individuals, and you strike a death blow to the offshore networks of these Russian oligarchs.
Yeah. Great, thanks for that. Jason, how have Russian sanctions come to inform some of the questions you've asked in your work, and perhaps introduce a little bit of your work too? Yeah.
Sure, thank you. I mean, first off, I'd just like to thank the Institute and Columbia for hosting me as well today. A lot of my work has been co-authored with Mike Finley and Dan Nilsson, both at the University of Texas at Austin. And we've started from the same difficult position as Brooke, because if you go and ask wealth managers or bankers or oligarchs about their financial affairs, they're not very forthcoming. It's very difficult to get information. Offshore in general, as Brooke has already said, at least historically, has been characterized by secrecy. So what to do as a researcher, and in particular, Mike, Dan and I have gone on this improbably long-running global mystery shopping expedition, whereby we impersonate a range of people, including would-be Russian sanctions breakers, and we solicit offers for shell companies and for associated corporate bank accounts. And the rough intuition behind this is if you want to find out if the rules work, whether they're financial sanctions or anything else, you should try to break them and see what happens. And if you can break them easily, and nothing bad happens to you, then you've got an indication that the rules don't work that well. Conversely, if it is difficult to break the rules, or if you do get penalized, then you've got, again, some confidence that the rules are more than just dead letter, more than just things written in the legislation or in regulation. The products we've been looking for have been shell companies, these kind of legal fictions, just a legal personality, but one of the main mechanisms for committing a whole range of related financial crimes, from tax evasion to money laundering, but certainly also sanctions busting. We've made thousands and thousands of approaches to hundreds and hundreds of providers.
And you do this over email?
We do this over email, soliciting these offers and see what we can get. When it comes in particular to sanctions on Russia, I think first off it's important to remember that there were sanctions on Russia before the invasion of Ukraine in February 22. Obviously the sanctions have been ratcheted up and strengthened, but in some ways there have been sanctions for up to 10 years, particularly on individual Russian government officials beforehand. So part of this research was to say, when we impersonate named Russian officials who are sanctioned on various sanctions lists, does it in fact make it more difficult, or are those people subject to any more scrutiny than boringly innocuous, normal-looking people? So when we email solicitation from, at least ostensibly, from Russian government officials, does it make any difference in the likelihood of, first off, getting a reply to our email solicitation? Second of all, are either law firms or banks, the two main sort of firms that we reply, are they any less likely to do business as they should, given that they're dealing with sanctioned individuals? And thirdly, if they are willing to do business with these high-risk Russian sanction names, are they any more likely to apply the rules about selling shell companies and associated corporate bank accounts? And the number one rule is really know your customer, to force customers to prove who they are as part of this overall global regime of trying to keep dirty money out of the financial system. It's a big, sprawling project, just one aspect on Russian sanctions, again, of this email mystery shopping. And we found that even when we tested sanctions on Russia that had been there from the invasion of Crimea originally in 2014 or even earlier, so we were interested in sanctions that would have been in place well before February 2022. And both offshore and elsewhere, we found out even in countries like Britain and the United States, that prior to the invasion of Ukraine, these sanctions really didn't make much difference. It was no more difficult for named sanctioned Russian officials, or at least our research assistants pretending to be named sanctioned Russian officials, that they were just as likely to get the engagement of Western banks and Western law firms, just as likely to be offered shell companies, and just as likely to be offered corporate bank accounts as very kind of boring, normal, innocuous people as well. We found out that in February 2022, we did a kind of before round, obviously not knowing that the full-scale invasion was going to happen. So we did one round of this mystery shopping with these sanction names in 2019 and then 2020. Then we did a subsequent round after the invasion, and we found out that even though the sanctions laws that we were looking at hadn't changed, these were ones that were there before February 2022, the attitude of providers, both offshore and onshore, had changed radically. That there was much more discrimination against named Russian officials, sanctioned Russian officials, and that both banks and law firms, despite the fact the law hadn't changed, that their attitude to enforcement radically had, for reasons that we think have much to do with the politics, with the moral repugnance that really swept the world, or at least large portions of the world of 2022, and of this idea of political and reputational concerns. So in that sense, it was the politics and the reputation of sanctions that made them effective, not the laws themselves, which in this case had been in power for a long time. We found this in most offshore centres as well as onshore, which again is a surprise because, as Brooke said, this is not what we associate, this kind of rigorous upholding of the law doesn't fit the popular stereotype of offshore. It's probably a big exception to the offshore, and that's maybe one we'll talk about in subsequent rounds, and that's probably Dubai, which is maybe a big part of the story to come, but I'll leave it there.
Perfect. And Kristen, you studied another part, related part of the offshore system. Same question to you.
All right, yeah, so in a way I'm looking, many wealthy people do what's known as structuring. They structure their wealth, they hold it in various forms of trust companies or through various vehicles so that it can, in a sense, protect them either from people knowing that they have this money or even from, just saving on taxes in various forms. So, it's often said that wealthy people structure themselves in terms of their money, but I look at how they do that in terms of mobility by looking at the global market in citizenship by investment and residence by investment, or golden passports and golden visas. And in looking at that, thinking about that world vis-a-vis the rise of Russian sanctions and the importance of this, especially this last round, it has been very interesting in terms of the geopolitics of it. So first of all, they're often especially with these sanctions, there's a halo effect. So it's not merely the individuals who are on the sanction list who are hit when it comes to mobility. It's actually anybody who's a Russian citizen or a Russian passport holder has been hit, in a number of countries in terms of mobility. It's just simply much, much harder to travel on that kind of passport and to do business on it as well, no matter what you think of the regime. So there's, it means that there's also large numbers of emigres, large numbers of people who voted with their feet, decided to leave Russia. I do not want anything to do with Putin's Russia, who've left, but they're still hit by those restrictions that have come against, especially in terms of mobility, the travel restrictions. So there's been an increase in demand for second citizenships, second passports, particularly among Russian citizens these days. But what's been very interesting within the space is the geopolitics of the field. So if you look at the countries that are big players in the golden passport market, citizenship by investment, it's really about 10. And about half of that market is dominated by Turkey, and about a third of that are 5 countries in the Caribbean. Ones you probably never heard about unless you like to go on beach holidays in the Caribbean. What's interesting there is that the U.S. has been able to tell other countries who they can and cannot naturalize, which is absolutely astounding when you think about citizenship. But it does say something about the role of the power of the U.S. So the U.S. has told the 5 Caribbean countries, as well as Malta, which is the only country that has a citizenship by investment program that also has visa-free access to the U.S., you cannot naturalize Russian citizens. And they've all fallen into line. And the U.S. follows up with these countries as well to make sure that they're doing it. So it's interesting, because if you're a Russian citizen, you can still get a visa to the U.S., you can still naturalize in the U.S., but the U.S. has ensured that these 6 countries cannot.
What about Cyprus? Sorry to...
Yeah, so Cyprus is an interesting one, and I'll also mention Turkey too. So Cyprus shut down its program in 2020 after Al Jazeera did an incredible undercover story that exposed corruption up to the highest levels of government. But traditionally, Russians were a core part of the Cypriot citizenship by investment market. And so there are a number of Russian citizens that hold Cypriot passports. I was recently talking with the head of the program in Malta, who said that actually after the US sanctions came in, they did a retrospective audit to see if any of the sanctioned individuals had gotten citizenship in Malta, and he said, thank goodness there were none. My guess is if Cyprus were to do that, they would probably find a slightly different story. In fact, I'm pretty sure that, because they also had, I think it was Deripaska had Cypriot citizenship, and I'm not sure if Abramovich was able to get it in the end or not. So Cyprus would be a big one, but I think even bigger right now is Turkey. So the U.S. has not been able to lean on Turkey in terms of, telling it whom it can and cannot naturalize. That might have something to do with the role of Turkey as a buffer state, keeping about 4 million refugees from coming into the EU. So there's not a lot that the EU or the U.S. says to Turkey about its citizenship policies. But it is naturalizing. It is, doing about 50% of the global market right now, which means, somewhere around, at the moment, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 applications per year. Add in the family members, so maybe additional, 2.5 family members on each application. So it is a sizable number who are coming through Turkey, which does no additional background checks than they do just on, their standard Interpol checks or whatever. It's probably fairly easy to work around that if you want. So Turkey has seen a huge increase in the number of Russians going through its programs, and even smaller programs that were not really desirable in the past. Egypt. It's a better passport than a Russian passport. And the U.S. hasn't been leaning on Egypt in terms of its program, so if you're a Russian citizen, you can now go through Egypt as well. Now, what's been interesting in looking at this, in terms of the relationship to sanctions, is that, so there is this question, well, can you use these additional citizenships as a workaround for sanctions? And I think really the only way that can happen is if you're changing your identity on it. If you're getting a new name printed on that new passport and using that to bank or do various things. That's now much, much more challenging to do in most countries than it is in the past. But Cambodia sells citizenship. Some years it does more than 100 approvals, and I went through and I looked at the list of people who've naturalized in Cambodia. And what's striking is that you don't see a lot of Russians, you see a lot of Chinese. In 2020, however, November 2020, there was a slew, there were about 24 people whose nationality was listed as Russian, but they had Chinese names who naturalized in Cambodia. Now, what's very interesting is that actually in Cambodia, there's a substantial number of people who naturalize who also change their name in the process. And offhand, I can't remember if it's about 25% or so. What was interesting is that there were only about 3 of those individuals who had changed their name in that process. And so I was kind of struck that Cambodia is not appearing as a big workaround for Russians or, even potentially sanctioned Russians in this. I mean, maybe something else is going on, these individuals with Chinese names, but claiming Russian citizenship. They could also be wealthy business people who, in Cambodia, you can't own the land your company is on unless you're a citizen, so they could be doing it for other reasons, but it was a notable trend.
Very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about how you go about doing your research. You've already given a flavor of this, and also whether it's getting more difficult to do your research now that perhaps these various constituencies are alerted to some of your work in the public sphere. So, Brooke, let's start with you. So you told us that you trained to do your PhD with wealth managers, and you took a course on wealth management. What was that like?
No, actually, I got my PhD in 1999, and I started wealth manager training after I'd been a professor for some years, so not until 2007. So in sociology, there's sort of an ethics rule that says you can't deceive people you want to study. I mean, you can, but if you do that, then you can't get research funding and you can't get your work published anywhere. So there are pretty strong incentives to prevent deception, which obviously creates some challenges. When I first mustered up the grant funding to go take this 2-year wealth management course, which turned out to be much more challenging than I was expecting.
Where was it?
Where was the course?
Yeah.
Well, it's all over. It's organized by an organization called STEP, the Society for Trust and Estate Practitioners. They produce what is arguably the only globally recognized credential for wealth managers. Somewhat equivalent to like a CPA for accountants, but it's recognized globally and no state can take it away. That's really important. Unlike other professions, you can't be sanctioned by the state, essentially, in the usual way that professions are. I don't know how it works in Greece, but in the United States, you can't be an accountant or a physician or an attorney without being licensed by the state. Not the federal government, but literally like in one of the individual 50 states. So if you misbehave, there's a pretty strong sanction of being able to yank your ability to practice. Well, you can't do that to wealth managers. There is no state that licenses them. But there is this London-based organization that is like a hub of information and training for wealth managers of the world. And they've even gotten a British university to offer an undergraduate degree in wealth management. I believe it's at the University of Manchester. That's a very recent development, though. Anyways, any one of you can go get wealth management training right now, as far as I'm aware. If you have to come up with about 75,000 euros to do it and have 2 years to spare. I got a sabbatical leave, which was sort of enhanced by extra grant funding, so I was able to do that. The initial challenge was even the people who funded me weren't very sure that anyone would talk to me if I marched into wealth manager training wearing a little badge that said, Brooke Harrington, academic. I just hope for the best. And I'd been a journalist before I went to get my PhD, so I knew a little something about marching into places I didn't belong and just playing it off, as we say in English, making the best of it and acting like I deserved to be there and bravely walking up to people I wasn't supposed to be talking to and asking them questions anyways. And that worked with wealth managers. I can easily imagine some situations where it wouldn't have worked. I certainly have colleagues who do things like they study street gangs. I couldn't have done this with a street gang. I don't look the part. But I could look convincingly like someone who belonged at a wealth management event. It's mostly men, but they're mostly also white, upper middle class. They know how to present themselves, and I could fake it convincingly enough that I wasn't instantly rejected as an interloper. And here was the thing I didn't anticipate, that I think no one really anticipated, which is wealth managers long to confess, almost in a Catholic sense. And that is because they feel maligned and misunderstood. They feel like the bad guys, unjustly so. And they're well-trained professionals, they're highly intelligent people. One of them said to me, I hate going to cocktail parties because people ask me what I do, and now when I say wealth manager, it's like saying I'm an executioner or something. It's considered shameful, and I'm proud of what I do. I'm good at my job. So there's a tension between the confidentiality to which all wealth managers are subject, sometimes by law. For example, if you're a Swiss wealth manager and you just accidentally reveal some information to a person on a bus, much less a journalist or a sociologist, about your client, you face not only civil penalties, but criminal penalties. So there are quite strong incentives to keep your mouth shut. On the other hand, they feel maligned. So they want to get what they regard as the truth about their work and the good things that their work does in the world. They want to get that out there. Their families are bored hearing about it. Their colleagues are potential competitors who could use the information to harm them professionally. So I come along and I know enough, being in these classes, I know enough that I can listen to them without stopping them every 2 seconds to say, wait, what does that word mean? What's a fiduciary? What's a bearer bond? I know what those things mean now because I've taken the classes. But I'm also not someone who is going to compete with them or use what they tell me to go steal their clients. I promised them anonymity, I promised them confidentiality, and I kept to it. I've never revealed their names, and I won't. And they just let loose on me. One guy only stopped talking to me after 3.5 hours because the cafe where we were sitting was closing and they were putting the chairs up on the tables. That's how much these people want to unload. I recognize this phenomenon from when I was a journalist. When I was 22 years old, I was working in the Associated Press Bureau of Atlanta, and people would cold call the bureau and want to get their story out. Sometimes they were Ku Klux Klan members, these sort of white supremacists. And I would just have to sit there very calmly and take my notes, with the understanding that they were trying to use me to launder their image. And I didn't have to let myself be used in that way, but I could just let them ramble on until they said something interesting. And that's exactly what I did with the wealth managers. I'm not sure, now that I've published a book about this, that I could ever do that again. It's kind of a bummer. I wish I could dive back into that world. But as far as I know, they haven't closed the door behind me. And it really is true that if any of you wanted to like gather up 75,000 euros and spend 2 years, you too could become a professional wealth manager.
Thank you. So Brooke talked about sort of ethics and the problem of getting this kind of research past your ethics board and that you're not supposed to deceive. And Jason, I would say your whole project is about deception, right? So A, how did you get it through your ethics board? And B, how do you handle inquiries from law enforcement who might be interested in the findings of you and your group?
Yeah, thanks. As Brooke has rightly said, there's a general presumption that it's unethical to use deception in academic research. But exactly as Alex said, I mean, we've just been lying to people non-stop on email since 2010 with these thousands of things. So what gives? And in fact, that under a specific range of circumstances, you are allowed to lie to people in social science research, but appropriately it's governed by certain rules. First off, that no one can come to harm as a result of the deception. And this again relates to the anonymity. So even if we find that people tell us ridiculously, outrageously immoral or even illegal things in our email solicitation, that we can't name the person or even the company that's involved. Secondly, we have to say that this is information we couldn't get another way. If you can get information without deception, then you should use that way. You shouldn't get it via through lying to people through deception. And our argument is that asking people, do you follow the rules, is not actually a very good way of finding out if people follow the rules. And that in fact, we need to find out what they do when they think they've got a real live customer on the line or the other side of an email account there. The other one is that there has to be some benefit to society as well. So if it's just, Brooke and Christian's books are unusual in reaching a wider audience. Most of the stuff academics publish is pretty specialized and, shall we say, rather niche. But at least for our research, we had to say, look, this is not just an intellectual parlor game. Knowing whether our rules against tax evasion and corruption and knowing whether our sanctions laws actually work is useful stuff for policymakers. These laws are important. They cost a lot of money to enforce. We don't really know if they work. And so we did actually get this through the ethics board. I should say as well, there's a bit of legal risk as well. Another reason that we don't mention people's names, either individuals or companies, is because they could sue us, which in Britain is a thing. In the United States, less so in terms of defamation. And the third thing we had to look out for as well is not just getting in trouble with the ethics board, not just being sued by private individuals, but also not being prosecuted by the US Department of Justice. If you try to break sanctions laws that the United States have enforced, that's punishable by a 10-year jail term. And as much as Mike, Dan, and I are committed to our research, we're not that committed. So we did get legal advice to make sure we weren't going to be prosecuted and sent to jail for 10 years as well. So yeah, certainly important to get our ducks in a row in all of those areas.
Fascinating. Kristen, what about you in terms of your own research methods and places that you've been and how you've gone about getting your information?
I found it actually fairly, a lot more straightforward than I would have thought at the beginning, as well as, fantastic in terms of travel. So I kind of stumbled into this world going to an industry conference. Like many industries, there are these industry conferences where businesses doing one part of the citizenship sale thing in this global market connect with other businesses, and then they connect with the governments. And occasionally there are these, conferences around the world that are aimed at, potential investors or potential buyers, and they're sort of, facing the client in a way. And I went to one of these things and I realized, oh my God, this is a big scene. It's not just cash for passports. There's a whole industry behind it. And there's the prime minister of a country that's over there who's talking about it because it's so important for the country. It's more than 20% of GDP. So he's out there talking about this too. And so I started going to these conferences and just basically asking people about their jobs. And I think probably similar to Brooke, people like talking about their jobs, and especially at a conference, So I would go up with my little academic thing and say, and I think also because I didn't go in with an agenda per se. I was just really curious about how this whole world works in the first place. Now, of course, you get a lot of company lines, and you get the story that as I'm sure all of you know, too, the story that people want to project of themselves or what they're doing and all of that. And then you can ask them about their competitors and see what they say about their competitors. And you can try to get at this from various different angles. And then, you can actually go to the countries themselves, and you can talk to locals, and you can talk to journalists, and you can, try to get as many different angles into this world to try to make sure that, try to understand what's really going on in all those cases. And because this is a global market, you've got, the countries that are the key, in effect of selling countries, and then you get the global hubs in different regions of the world where you've got the buyers.
What are the buying countries?
The buying countries right now, it used to be China, but COVID hit China pretty hard. Now you can just talk about like the Middle East, which would be Iraq, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Russia, post-Soviet countries are really big, but with very limited options. It's Turkey. But those are, and the interesting thing within this is the rise of U.S. citizens. And that's going to, I think, really reshape the field as well. So I ended up going to now, I think, 19 different countries to trace how this market works. And what's been interesting, too, in connecting back to sanctions, and this kind of the geopolitics of the U.S. going in much more strongly now, et cetera, is that it's made my life a lot easier because I'm also interested in the numbers and understanding how many countries are doing this. So there's been pressure that's very top down on these countries because, of course, there's stuff that goes on the side, et cetera, as you might be able to imagine. But it's also meant that that's also created more bottom-up pressure within the countries that are selling as well, where locals are recognizing not only how important it can be financially for a country, but also what are the real risks too. And that's made my life much, much easier in terms of getting good numbers about what's going on.
Interesting. So one more round of questions. So take this however you want it. Maybe let's go reverse order, and Brooke will end with you this time. Is the offshore world changing? Is this secretive sort of place that you trained as a wealth manager, you sent these email experiments, you went to these conferences? It's just as important, it seems, as it has been. We've had these leaks, Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, so forth. We've had sanctions. And yet it's still this enormous thing, but is its character changing? Is it becoming more non-Western, post-Western? Are different countries using it? What are your impressions now after working in this space for a while?
Yeah, that's a very interesting topic, and I think it'll also probably connect to what Jason will say too. One of the biggest, I've been looking at this field for now about a decade, and the two big changes are that nobody would have expected 10 years ago is that, number one, Turkey, a big country, is now half the global market in terms of sales. And number two is the enormous rise in the number of US citizens who are going for these programs. And the rise of Turkey is really important, in part, as I was describing in terms of the geopolitics and how much harder it is for global powers to, in effect, surveil Turkey. But it's also, and to wrap it into, because of course in Greece, there's a very strong or popular golden visa program. To wrap this, from just looking at golden passports to also golden visas. The Greek program has become very, very big. It's probably about 3,000 approvals per year. There's a big bump up in 2022, then a drop off in 2023 as well. Probably about 50% are Chinese. The second most popular country is Turkey, but that's less than 10%, and it's kind of that array of Middle Easterners who are the second biggest group in demand in terms of these. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the number one purveyor of golden visas is the UAE. So if Greece does about 5,000 application approvals, or not, 3,000 application approvals per year, UAE does 50,000 It's huge. And what does it take to become a tax resident in the UAE? All you have to do is be physically present there once every 6 months. So if you want to develop, in a sense, the sort of profile needed, and the UAE will do this for Russians too, and you can get a golden visa within a couple of weeks doing the application online. So if you want to build a sort of profile that is acceptable for banks in various ways, it's much, much easier to do it through a UAE golden visa than it is through a lot of these citizenship by investment programs themselves. So I think there's a very, very big South-South story that's not being told. You get the European Union that's very, very concerned about visa-free access to the EU, et cetera, security concerns, but Turkey doesn't have visa-free access to the EU. It's really only elite Turks who are able to get I can't remember if it's the green or the red passport that does give that. And so that's been a huge important development. The other one is that a lot of the key risks are not only in golden visas and golden passports, but in neighboring options like business investor visas present many of the same banking risks or identity risks as these sorts of programs. Are much more, they're found in many, many more countries, and there's very little due diligence, background checks performed on those sorts of people. And the list can go, Poland, there's a case going through the courts in Poland right now, VisaGate, in which up to as many as 300,000 visas were pretty much sold through its embassies and consulates. These are Schengen visas, so it gives complete access to the European Union with zero, with lots of workarounds to the application process in the first place. So there's a lot of really big risks around visas and passports that really extend beyond these programs themselves.
Thanks. Yeah, I think probably three big changes to offshore. One, the kind of moral stigma that Brooks referred to. Second, and probably a change in demand. And thirdly, a change in the regulatory environment. I remember, talking to one offshore lawyer who was sick of, he talked about the dinner party test, and it's exactly the point that Brooke raised. People say, what do you do? And if you say offshore lawyer, then you get this harangue about how immoral you are. So he'd refined this line. He said, well, I'm a human rights lawyer who protects privacy and property, which, maybe. So first off, I think that offshore has been much more stigmatized, particularly since, probably over the last 10 years, maybe since the financial crisis as well. I think the second one is kind of that, ironically, offshore has become much more transparent, much less secretive than it was before. And this is partly a result of global regulatory change, probably more associated with tax and money laundering than sanctions. But in fact, it's much, much harder to get financial secrecy now than it was perhaps 10 and certainly 20 years ago. And I think certainly that's the case if you're a citizen of a rich country. If you're a poor country, it may be a little different. And in fact, somewhat ironically, in very different ways, the two places that are most secretive, again, probably the UAE, Dubai, but the other one would be the United States as well, which is an excellent mechanism for evading tax unless you're an American. But for everyone who's not an American, the United States is great as a tax haven.
Okay, tell us more about this. Why is the United States, or rather certain states in the U.S., such secretive jurisdictions? What do you mean by this?
Well, maybe two things. So first off, I mentioned this idea of shell companies before, and this, why would you hold your bank account in your personal name where you could set up a company, ABC, and just have ABC company hold the asset for you, and as long as ABC company can't be traced back to you, then it's a perfect kind of screen or corporate veil to obscure your financial dealings. And in the US, up until recently, and probably still now, you can get these shell companies very easily and very cheaply. And in fact, my co-author Mike Finley set one up in 137 seconds last year. So when I mean quickly, I mean really quickly. In your coffee break, you can set it up with no proof of identity required. Okay? This is not something you can do in the Cayman Islands. This is not something you can do in the British Virgin Islands or the Seychelles. You can do it in Nevada. You can do it in Wyoming. You can do it in South Dakota. So that would be reason one for the US The second one is that just about every country in the world has committed to a big scheme of exchanging tax information, which works on the basis of country A gives information to country B, and country B gives information to country A, which you think, well, that sounds pretty fair and simple. The exception to this is the United States, which demands tax information from every other country in the world, but refuses to reciprocate. Okay? So again, as long as you're not an American, again, the US works fantastically well for tax evasion, which again is a change. So yeah.
And that drives year-over-year increases in American citizens attempting to renounce their citizenship. It used to be you could just march into a consulate and do it for free. Now they charge you, last time I checked, it was $3,500, and there were months-long waiting lists to get an appointment to do that. They've tried to make it really hard. One of the first practitioners of this strategy was Eduardo Saverin, who was one of the founders or early funders of Facebook. He faffed off to Singapore instead because he didn't want to pay American taxes. Just to pick up on your point, Jason, about the U.S. being the tax haven, it's also a sanctions haven for the same secrecy reasons. In fact, right after February 2022, when sanctions started coming down on Russian oligarchs, guess where they went to evade the sanctions the U.S. was putting on them? They were buying up real estate in Florida and New York using shell companies. The Justice Department in the US had to issue some very sternly worded letters to the attorneys general of the states of Florida and New York saying, we know those Russians are very profitable property buyers. They would pay way over asking price. And the state would get some sort of tax revenue from that. But it was U.S. states who were essentially helping sanctioned Russian oligarchs evade federal U.S. policy. That's how deep this game goes. Two things I see in terms of the changes to offshore. One is geography. The success in creating greater transparency in the offshore system has driven more and more of the business of offshore to places that will secure secrecy for real. So business in Switzerland is way down, even though it was long a sort of status symbol to have a Swiss wealth manager and Swiss accounts, just like it was a status symbol to have a Swiss watch. But as a practical matter, you can no longer be very certain that your secrecy will be protected there. So the smart money now goes to Singapore. Singapore has picked up a ton of business because of what's happened to Switzerland. By the same token, I have a new paper out with my colleagues at Dartmouth who do network science. And that paper is all about the ways that oligarchs from different regions of the world use the offshore system. And as more people from developing countries, or specifically this paper is about the BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, they have very distinct patterns in their uses of offshore. One of their distinct patterns is they make a lot of use of what are called blacklisted offshore jurisdictions. Now, Jason has written very eloquently about the attempts, largely successful, of many smaller offshore centers to get out from under the OECD's blacklist, which was long considered sort of a death sentence for non-cooperative jurisdictions.
So just to clarify for the audience, the OECD would list you as a non-cooperative entity, and then that would terminate your business effectively.
Yeah, it would cut you off from big parts of the international financial system. I mean, Jason can clarify this better than I can, but offshore jurisdictions and STEP, the organization that created the credential program that I took, they fought that tooth and nail successfully. So it was a surprise to find in the Panama, Paradise, and Pandora Papers data that in fact there's these waves of business that go to blacklisted jurisdictions. Why? Because if you're really, really, really serious about secrecy and your government doesn't have a whole lot of capacity to check out what you're doing, you're going to go to the blacklisted jurisdictions. So rather than being a death sentence, it's almost become like a badge of honor. The way for some right-wingers in the US, it's a badge of honor to have been arrested for violating federal law. So that's changing the geography of offshore and the kinds of products that are being offered, and it's keeping this, what were once thought marginalized group of offshore centers very much in business.
Which ones?
Nevis, for one. Nevis got spanked pretty hard by blacklisting. A lot of Caribbean destinations, actually. I get them mixed up sometimes, but I think it was the BVI where the premier was found to be running a drug dealing operation of his very own, in addition to allowing all kinds of other shocking corruption and not being very cooperative about sharing tax information with other countries who demanded it legally under the treaties that exist for tax sharing.
All right, so after that whirlwind tour, I'm sure you might have your own questions about the offshore system or golden visas or passports or anything else you might want to talk about today. Let me just ask you to raise your hand and just tell us who you are, and please speak into the microphone. So this is go to Sophia.
Hello, my name is Sofia Tipaldu. I'm assistant professor at Padua University in IR. I would like to bring the conversation to the role of Russia again. So how do all these offshore companies, what you very well described today, how did this play back to the war in Ukraine? Do you see any results that this might have had on the war today? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can see a big pattern of displacement in Russian trade, which are the sort of things that Alex has mentioned, about importing a lot more from China and from Central Asia. But you can also see big patterns in the shift of finance as well from Russia. And that not only has this been a lot less contact with the West, but somewhat surprisingly with the kind of traditional tax havens, many of which are kind of semi-sovereign British dependencies, but also places like Switzerland getting less Russian wealth. And the places that tends to be going is, again, Dubai, but Turkey as well. So I think in that sense you can see that in terms of the question is, well, what difference has that made to the actual conduct of the war? I think the answer has been very little. And I think that's a fact of, it depends how much power you think oligarchs had or have in the Russian political system. Up to a point, if oligarchs don't have much power over the decision to launch the invasion or the conduct of the war, then conceivably no amount of pain, financial or otherwise, caused to the oligarch or oligarchs collectively will make a difference to the conduct of the war. But there are other people who know far more about Russia than I do in the room, so that's all I'd say.
Alex and I wrote a piece for Foreign Affairs back in, was it October of 22? In which our contention was, as Jason is saying, opinion varies about how much influence oligarchs have on what Russia actually does. But we do know that these oligarchs who were sort of positioned in Europe, people like Abramovich, for example, they served an important function to sort of do a charm offensive on Western governments, using their yachts, using their villas, using their private jets. So the threat to sanction them by taking those toys away was sort of cutting off Russian influence operations within Western Europe. To that point, it seems like sanctions have succeeded because they've basically driven the oligarchs and their toys into isolation in places like Dubai, where they can no longer schmooze the heads of state and policymakers in Western Europe. But if the intent of the sanctions was to punish the oligarchs and maybe incite revolt against Putin, Obviously, that hasn't happened, and these blacklisted jurisdictions, places like Dubai, have been instrumental in basically making the sanctions ineffective. Because if you were quick enough, if you saw the sanctions coming, you could just move your assets out of harm's way, out of the reach of the sanctions. So Dubai was a really great place to do this. And I think Jason mentioned earlier that many of the people who were sanctioned after the invasion in February 22 have long experience being sanctioned by the US and the UK and the EU. So it wasn't their first rodeo, and they knew exactly how to get their assets to move around, using the kind of mobility that Kristen talks about, but for money, not for people and passports. In fact, many of them, their wealth managers are prepared with like plan A, plan B, plan C. If I get sanctioned by this jurisdiction, the assets automatically move to another jurisdiction where they'll be out of harm's way. I don't know if you have in Greece anything like this game that we play at carnivals in America. It's called whack-a-mole. And you get a little mallet, and there's a board in front of you with like 9 holes, and there's this little creature who pops up called a mole. And your job is to try and use that mallet and whack the mole on the head before it disappears and pops up somewhere else. And it's very hard to win because the mole is so quick about moving around. Sanctions regimes always end up playing whack-a-mole with oligarchs, particularly Russian oligarchs, because they've had many years to practice evading sanctions through asset mobility.
I think I agree with all that. I think one of the interesting developments, and I see here also our colleague Zoe Ryder has worked a lot on kleptocracy at National Endowment for Democracy, and before that POGO and Transparency International. I think one of the really interesting things that happened is how quickly this group, this community that was very active in anti-corruption work, and for years had been saying, sanction the oligarchs have this kind of, really either illegal or kind of, really borderline, source of wealth, but the oligarchs always managed to buy very good representation, launder the reputations, had the best lawyers, the PR agencies would threaten to sue people with sort of exposés on them, but how quickly that became securitized, yeah? And in almost 2 days, the US Department of Justice came out with, this kind of big proclamation, oligarchs, you're on notice, we're coming after you, right? And we created KleptoCapture, right? This new interagency site sort of dedicated to do this. And so I had a twofold reaction. One was, on the one hand, it was good that we were finally going to enforce anti-corruption rules, but why did it take a war and the securitization of this to make it a priority? Yeah? And so I think there's a real kind of, I was quite conflicted about that, right? That this is now part of the war effort when it should be part of just, routine global governance, cooperative transparency, things that we should all want. This shouldn't actually be geopoliticized. So that doesn't answer your question, Sophia, but I think it was one of the interesting kind of things that sprung out. Right. Please.
Thank you. Hello. Okay. Thanos Gousioulis, Assistant Professor, University of Nottingham. I have one question about, it's more about methods, less about the offshore world. How can we effectively study the effects of Russian sanctions? I recently read a work by Jeff Sonnenfeld. I would like to hear your opinion about him, because he makes a claim that actually the sanctions against Russia are effective, and the claim that he makes is that we rely far too much on Rostat, and essentially IMF and World Bank are replicating this data, which should be more scrutinized, and we're reaching some wrong conclusions on whether these sanctions are effective or not. So maybe a comment about that.
Should we take one more and we'll bundle them? Zoe?
Hi, this is Zoe Ryder with the National Endowment for Democracy. Yeah, sort of following that question, we're focused very much on sanctioning oligarchs, but there's a lot of other forms of sanctioning that have been happening, and export controls that I think it would be great to hear from the panelists to what degree you see that having impact, and especially what it might imply if Russia is now becoming not just a war economy, but what some scholars call a war society, because of all of those sanctioning tools in some degrees being effective, and also, of course, it has less room to be something else. So if you could just speak to the different forms of sanctions that aren't targeting the oligarchs, but are targeting sectors. And then I also have a question for Brooke. I'm just going to throw it in, which is, I had not understood that those leaks were being shared with academics, so I'm very excited to hear that they are. And I'd really be curious how your network analysis deals with the problem of, and you touched on it right when you opened this, at the beginning of this, like the kind of knowledge you need besides the sort of software, et cetera, for network analysis, which is more like the people who know the people, right? There's like that ground truth that complements what you can see through the sort of patterns analysis. And I'm wondering if that's what you were touching on, or like if you, what are you able to see and what are you able to not see with the capacity for network analysis you have as an academic?
Okay. Yeah, why don't you answer first, and then we'll...
Okay, I'll take that first. It's not that the data has been shared with academics. The data is shared with the world. You can go right now to the ICIJ website. That's the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And nope, we're just using what's public. And I think they've been really quick, I mean, amazingly quick about putting data out in the public domain. They don't share everything, and they won't share everything because some of it's identifying like photocopies of people's passports. And they don't want to get sued either. They're pretty careful about that. So, you know, there are terabytes upon terabytes upon terabytes, like 100 million files or pretty close to it. The problem with it is that it's very difficult to use. As I said, I alluded to that the fact that the data are organized in such a way that it's useful if you're a journalist and you're investigating a particular person. Like if you want to know about, you know, what Bob Smith from Azerbaijan has been up to, you go right to that ICIJ website, you look up everything on Bob Smith, bada bing, bada boom, very useful. But if what you want is to understand the big picture network links among oligarchs and wealth managers and their shell companies and their foundations and trusts, you have to manually clean these millions of files. And that's why you haven't seen much academic research using this incredible data source. It is incredible, but it requires a huge upfront investment. The other thing is you have to know what the words mean. Like, there are things in there that you maybe wouldn't know if you hadn't been trained as a wealth manager. Like, the data frequently use the term intermediary. Well, what exactly do they mean by an intermediary? Sometimes they mean a wealth manager, but other times they mean someone who sells their name as a front for somebody's corporate registration. And you have to be able to pick those apart very carefully in order to get meaningful patterns from it. Have I answered your question? There was more to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. We can follow on this tomorrow as well during our workshop. So I'll say something about sanctions and export controls and the variety of things that have been brought up just from the perspective of someone who studies Central Asia, right? I think it took a while, but I think it's no exaggeration to say all of the Central Asian states now are, some more than others, but certainly the re-export trade that is based on sanctions evasion is a now development strategy in Central Asia. I'll just be really honest, right? We see record levels of growth, right, across places like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. It's not all driven by sanctions evasion in the intermediary trade, but I'll give you one example, right? So there are certain goods that are restricted and some that are prohibited, and of course dual-use goods, right? But then there are other goods that might contain component, microchips being one, right, that are legal. So what do? You take microchips out of washing machines that you purchase from South Korea. You import these into Kyrgyzstan, and because Kyrgyzstan is part of the Eurasian Economic Union, these can go duty-free into Russia itself, where then the washing machines are taken apart, the microchip processors then are taken and put into something. And it's the same story across a number of goods. Now, there are certain types of technologies this can work and certain types of technologies where it's more restricted. But the point I want to make here is if you're a Western country, US, the European Union, and you know Kyrgyzstan is doing this, and you know that very high up leadership, right, and family members are involved in this, what are your options, right? On the one hand, you can sanction a particular entity, a particular company, right, and try and make a demonstration effect of them, right? And we've tried that with a couple of Central Asian companies. But you know, to impose secondary sanctions, right, Iran-type sanctions, we say, now we are cutting you off from access to dollar transactions, that's an overwhelming penalty. And all that is going to do is reinforce this other geoeconomic space of sort of links in the post-Soviet era. So I think this sort of sanctions adaptation, it's taken on different flavors in different sort of places, but I think the bottom line is anytime you have a restriction, right, you will get an opportunity to profit and rent seek over it, right? And so those who are in positions to make these networks work are finding it quite lucrative at the moment. Jason, did you want to say something? Sanctions too?
Yeah, just really briefly. I mean, I suppose the other thing is, of course, you know, half the world, it's not as if it's just a compliance problem. Half the world, at least, is not applying sanctions, including, of course, big democracies, many in Latin America, India, Turkey, and so on. You know, this is but not applying financial sanctions, not applying trade sanctions. I think the puzzle for sanctions is that they're ever more popular with policymakers, and academics have always been very skeptical about actually their effectiveness. You know, there's a slight "we told you so" dynamic to this. Having said that, I think Russia's economy had big problems even before 2022, and you know, it's one thing getting chips out of washing machines, but that's a pretty expensive way of buying microchips as well. And that means that there's a fair opportunity cost to there. The other area of the West, in fact, does have the ability to do more damage to the Russian economy, which it is not taken up and not even spoken about, is demographically. Russia has major demographic problems, and of course, for everyone who gets killed. But as Kristen has said, the one thing that Westerners could do to undermine Russia, but is not only not done but not spoken about, is let Russians flee Russia to move to the West, which many of them would like to do. But that has not been an option. And if you look at Russia's demography, even before the invasion, let alone afterwards, if you want to do long-term damage to the Russian, or even short-term damage to the Russian economy, given the labor shortages, then let Russians come to the West.
I think that's an interesting point, and also this hundreds of thousands, or almost hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of IT workers who in March were scrambling to leave Russia ended up in Armenia, in Georgia, and Turkey, and most of them have returned now. Because they didn't have those exit options.
I was going to pick up on that point, because we've been talking quite a lot about Turkey and the UAE as particularly important hubs for movement of money and things in and out of Russia, but also for people. And it's a real mixed bag. And I have been to both places recently. And you definitely have these different financial flows being rerouted through that. You definitely have people working both sides of the border through that. But you do have a lot of emigres. And you have a lot of emigres there not because they like the weather in Dubai, but because they can't get visas for other places. And these are people who are against the regime, et cetera. And I think the other thing to keep in mind in thinking about sanctions too is this thing of the question of which sanctions lists. So Ukraine has a particular, set of, sanctions lists. The U.S. has one. The UK has one. So actually thinking about the policy implications and how those get enforced, I think we also have to remember that there's multiple lists as well, along with the fact that half the world is not bothered as much by this as powerful Western countries.
I'd like to go till about 7:30, so we have time for a couple more questions. So yes, here in the front, and then we'll go to David.
Thanks. It seems that apart from trying to corner or to redirect the destination of havens onshore to the U.S., and there is always Delaware from a long
Yes.
time ago. I'm reading here just now as we're talking that from 2020, 55 Fortune 500 corporations paid zero taxes
Yep.
in the States. And I'm reading here that Apple in 2013 moved from Ireland to Jersey and hit $252 billion. So I think that if you have the mainstream of the financial world using this circuitry or this plumbing, you know, the occasional, the rest it's drivel compared to it. So unless somebody is really prepared to rewire the entire system, and in doing so, to destroy the profitability of a lot of these companies which serve a lot of the agenda, not just economically, but also in terms of, you know, control, infiltration, information sharing, etc., etc. Unless you're willing to really punish them, there is no way that you're going to corner the mouse. I mean, if you don't take care of the rest of the sewer. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that. And we'll go to David and then, go ahead, Stefanos.
Stefanos Gandolfo from the Columbia Global Center here in Athens. Just a very quick follow-up on that. It seems that we have all the knowledge of the world of, you know, quite intimate knowledge of how the system works and what we need to do to control it in many ways. Then do you think it's an issue of like lack of political control, of political will, because it would require controlling larger corporations or other geopolitical issues? So my question is, what's your involvement, engagement with policymakers in terms of fixing all of these loopholes?
Yeah. Perfect. And can I also just welcoming you to the Athens Global Center, Stefanos? We're really delighted you're at the helm. So thanks so much. I know it's your first week here. David.
Thanks so much. David Lewis, University of Exeter in the UK. I had a question about onshoreization. There's some evidence from the Russian economy that their pretty rapid growth, 5% in the first quarter, is partly funded by the fact there's a lot of money swirling around that would normally have left the country, and instead, for all the reasons we've talked about, is not going out to offshore centers. Does that mean that, paradoxically, all these clampdowns, all these sanctions, is actually having a completely counterproductive effect? All this money is now inside Russia, funding the war machine. People are paying taxes, and you know, instead of getting your money out of the country, if you're an oligarch, you simply pay your money into a voluntary military company as a different kind of protection for your property. So to what extent is onshoreization a real thing? And is it perhaps happening in other countries as well? China might be another example.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And was there one in the front here? Did you have a question? Or no? Okay. All right, perfect. So lots of food for thought here on important topics. Who wants to start with the corporate angle of this? Jason, I know you've thought about this.
Sure. I mean, I think that probably the two comments link together. I mean, what can we do that we're choosing not to do, and what is not possible to do? I think there it's important to make a distinction between corporate tax avoidance within the law but against the spirit of it, versus tax evasion, which is illegal. And actually, I think that at least for rich countries, over the last 10 or 20 years, rich countries have proved to be pretty effective in tackling tax evasion, particularly when it's by private people. And part of that has been effectively beating up on small island states, which is a fairly practical thing to do. I think where there is the ability but not the political will is exactly the sort of figures, particularly in the United States, but not just the United States, and there's a deep hypocrisy for European governments as well as decrying corporate tax avoidance and schemes, meanwhile fiercely competing amongst themselves to offer the best possible deal to corporations to relocate to places like the Netherlands and Ireland and Luxembourg, all the time while beating up on small tropical island states and places like improbably Cambodia and Namibia. So I think for the corporate tax avoidance, that's exactly a question of political will of governments, just rich country governments simply choosing not to address the problem.
Kristen, do you have any thoughts on these?
Yeah, I mean, so very briefly, this is what Jason was talking about. There's a PhD student at the LSE right now who's completing a PhD looking at common reporting standard and implementation and how Switzerland and the UK have dodged this precisely in part because they want to protect their own. And they know this is important for the economies. And then also thinking about the inshoreization in terms of the Russian economy and the massive growth that it's seen. Certainly, yeah, but I kind of wonder if that is good up until the point when planes start crashing and nobody wants to take a flight within the country because it's so hard to get parts for the planes that they do start crashing at a very high rate. So I think it's interesting because I've been in debates about that from both sides, but I think some of those risks are quite dire as well.
Yeah, I'll turn it over to Brooke in a sec, but just, one intervention on David's point. Also when you think about the Western corporate pullout, right, that happened in the first weeks, McDonald's, IKEA, and so forth, they stranded these assets. Well, who did these assets go to, right? They went to political loyalists and they became new sources of patronage to distribute to political clients, right? So on the one hand, McDonald's was, taking a clear stand, right, and leaving. On the other hand, like the basic infrastructure is operating, but is now in Russian hand, and it's actually a symbol of sanctions defiance, right, and moving along. So, yeah, thanks for that, David.
As I was heading over here today, I saw in the news that the ruble had dropped precipitously in value. Yesterday it was worth 90 rubles to the dollar, and today it's 200, and there are runs on the bank that the Russian banks are apparently trying to prevent Russians from withdrawing their assets. I don't know, I'll defer to the Russian experts in the room on whether interpretation of that is accurate, but what I've been reading is that's evidence that sanctions are at long last working. So there's some evidence of disruption within the Russian economy as a result of sanctions. To Stefanos' point about what then must we do, as Tolstoy put it, a lot of the reason that nothing has been done is that what we see in the Panama and Paradise and Pandora Papers is it violates the spirit of the law, but it adheres to its letter. So there's a wonderful emeritus professor of law at Oxford named Doreen McBarnett who coined the term creative compliance for what wealth managers do. That's where you violate the spirit while adhering to the letter of the law. And that's how the other secret ingredient of offshore finance, secrecy on the one hand and creative compliance on the other. That's why despite all these terabytes of data from the offshore leaks, there have been hardly any prosecutions and maybe fewer than a dozen convictions worldwide, despite all that evidence that's been dumped into the public domain. One of the things that jumped out to me when those offshore leaks started happening and really in earnest in 2016 was that everybody is in on this above a certain level of wealth. If you remember seeing the sort of parade of horribles that newspapers would post with photographs of people who were named in the offshore leaks, it was everybody from heads of state to heads of corporations to Jackie Chan and Emma Watson, beloved celebrities. And the impression that one gets is that there's this elite club of people. Maybe they only number in less than 5 figures, but they're all using offshore. Even the Queen of England showed up in the Paradise Papers. So there's a huge problem of elite conflict of interests. especially at the national level. The people in policymaking circles who are actually empowered to shut down a lot of the abuses of the offshore system are themselves beneficiaries of it. Exhibit A was David Cameron after the Panama Papers. I'm old enough to remember when he would wag his finger at British boy bands who would incorporate in Ireland to avoid UK taxes. He came down really hard on them in public. Lo and behold, Panama Papers come along. Guess who's a beneficiary of an offshore trust? Mr. Cameron. And then in the Pandora Papers, we saw people like Andre Babish and I think his name is Uhuru Kenyatta in Kenya, both of whom had run explicitly on anti-corruption platforms. They were not just avoiding taxes, but engaged in like industrial scale corruption using layers and layers of offshore structures. So even the good guys, the people whose public face in politics is, I'm going to crack down on abuses of the tax code or abuses of the offshore system, they're in on it too. They are the bad guys. So when I'm asked to consult to national or collective bodies like the OECD or the European Parliament on what to do about abuses of the offshore system, most of the people who work in those bodies are lawyers by training. And so there's this phrase in American English, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. To lawyers, everything looks like a legal problem. We just need another law, the magic bullet law that's going to put a stop to all this. My answer as a sociologist is, nah, the oligarchs have better lawyers than you do, and they have deeper pockets and more time. And they can fight you in ways you can't even imagine. They'll keep you in court for 20 years, and they'll win by war of attrition. Happens all the time. And that's one of the reasons that, for example, the US tax authorities for decades have not been going after the most abusive tax avoiders and evaders in the US system, because those people have better lawyers than the government. So what I say to the people who are in policymaking positions is, what tends to move the needle in all manner of social problems is public opinion. At the beginning of the 21st century, hardly anyone knew or cared about corporate tax avoidance. You know, the stuff that's legal but is now considered kind of immoral. Several people mentioned like Apple and Starbucks not paying any taxes or anything close to their fair share. 25 years ago, nobody cared. In fact, it was considered a corporate duty. It's fiduciary duty. You have to maximize shareholder value, and that includes paying the absolute bare minimum of tax required by law and not 1 penny more. Somebody decided to make that a social problem, and all of a sudden a social movement coalesced around it. So it certainly hasn't stopped the problem, but it has shamed the heck out of a lot of these companies and caused them to kind of dial it back a little bit. That is a social norm force. And my argument to policymakers is social norms often do what the law cannot. They work faster, and they work specifically in those gray areas between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Because most people's reaction to what we find out in these offshore leaks is, that shouldn't be legal. I don't care if it is legal, it shouldn't be legal.
All right. I'm going to end on that note of optimism, given the topic, and take it. But I do want to thank here IDIS and Pandian University. I want to thank all of you for joining us today in the audience. I would invite you to interact with our panelists afterwards here and learn more about their work. Thank you on behalf of the Columbia Global Center, on behalf of Columbia's Harriman Institute, and we look forward to our next event and continuing partnership. Thanks so much.